Yeah, we're looking at Hannah's story. Looking forward to getting into this together tonight. But my first question is, who do you turn to when times are tough? Who do you turn to when times are tough? Well, when there are big things going on in the world, like Ukraine or earthquakes or Islam being on the rise or just the cost of living crisis, sometimes we feel like our little, seemingly insignificant issues are just unimportant in the big scheme of things. And my question is, how do we know that God sees and cares about us and the details of our lives when all this other big stuff is going on? How do we know we can trust him to answer our prayers during these times? And the story of Hannah is just a beautiful picture of God's love and care for a seemingly unimportant individual in the midst of a major development in God's plan for the salvation of mankind. And as we look at the story tonight, we're going to pull out 3 principles. They're in your handouts, so there's a wee freebie for you. Just to help us to see in the text what God is doing and how we can trust him when we're going through tough times. So for context, the world was in crisis when Hannah's story begins. This story takes place at the end of the time of the Judges. Now, you got a wee bit of the Judges context last time from Marion, I believe. But just to recap, moral decline has reached an all-time low. People are doing what is right in their own eyes and pleasing themselves rather than pleasing God. God is rejected as king in preference for a human king. And Israel have decided they don't want to be God's special people anymore, set apart and distinct. They just want to be like the other nations around them. The last chapters of Judges are about the darkest in the whole of the Bible, and there's no sign at this stage of the promised Saviour to come. So that is the backdrop to which we get the story of this girl whose life is in crisis. So let's read from 1 Samuel 1, 1 to 8. And it's there in your text as well. Excuse me if my pronunciation isn't quite right. There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroam, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives. One was called Hannah, the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas were 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. Because the Lord had closed her womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. But whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Her husband, Elkanah, would say to her, "Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" We'll pause there. So here we see Hannah's predicament. First of all, she's childless. And not being able to have children is enormously painful in any culture. As you saw in Kata's talk a couple of months ago about Sarai's situation, there was a certain predicament in the nation of Israel for childless women. So before Christ came, it wasn't just painful on a personal level, but culturally it was very shameful, as it was seen as being a curse from God. This comes from the fact that children were the means by which the kingdom of God grew. So Adam and then Noah were commanded to go forth and multiply so that God's image would be taken all across the world as the world was filled with people. The nation of Israel, God's chosen people and God's voice to the nation, grew in number through biological childbirth. So those people who were not able to have children were not able to be part of fulfilling the command of expanding God's kingdom across the earth. That was the situation that Hannah was in. Now, just as an aside, in the New Testament, God's people and God's kingdom don't depend on biological childbirth, but rather through spiritual reproduction, when people are brought into the kingdom by being born again through the Spirit. His image and name are spread across the earth through people becoming Christians through spiritual reproduction. So folks like myself are not excluded from being part of furthering of God's kingdom because we don't have children. But let's go back to the situation that we're in Hannah's day. So despite being a God-fearing woman and a God-worshipping Jew, she would have been treated as one whom God had cursed because of her infertility. This is Hannah's predicament. The second thing about her predicament is that she was misunderstood. And as if to add to the pain of not having children, we see that she is misunderstood and mistreated by her close family. Peninnah treats her as though she's cursed, as if the infertility was her own fault. And we see that even though her husband loved her, he misunderstood the pain that she was in by taking a second wife, for one, but also thinking that he was the answer to her agony. I mean, he thought, am I not better than 10 sons? You know, he just didn't get it. It would have been a lonely and agonizing existence for Hannah. And we can see that in the text, can't we? She wept, she wouldn't eat. And many of us know too well the feeling of distress, whether for these kind of reasons or for other situations in our lives. Circumstances beyond our doing or our control have led to our own personal time of crises. We might even feel misunderstood or ostracized or mocked by those who ought to know us best. And it's easy to wonder, where is God in all this? Does he see? Does he get it? Does he understand? Does he blame me for the predicament that I'm in? Have I angered him in some way? And to have all these kind of questions. However, this is not the case with our all-seeing and all-powerful God. And we can see this here, that she is, yes, she's childless, yes, she's misunderstood, but she is seen. And the text tells us about that. So we read twice in the text here that God closes or had closed Hannah's womb. And it's interesting because that's something that the author's written for you and me as readers. It's to tell us that God wasn't unaware of the situation, but rather he was at work within it, even though it wasn't working out in the way that Hannah had hoped or in the timing that she had hoped. This little note refers to his activity being, he is actively involved in her life. He hadn't turned a blind eye to her situation. It was, part of something he was doing. So it meant that it wasn't something that was a result of sin or a curse or a biological condition. God was sovereign over this situation. So it wasn't that he didn't see or didn't understand, but rather he saw her and was working on a plan in her life through this situation that was far bigger than anybody could see. And so we have our first principle. God is sovereign over the crises in our lives. God is sovereign over the crises in our lives. And because of that, nothing can happen to us that he is not sovereign over. So our lives are not out of his control. We might not always be in control, but none of it is out with God's control. And also, because he is sovereign, he is never not able to step in and to see and to comfort and to work for good in the circumstances of our lives. So that's our first principle. Hannah may not have known explicitly what God was doing, but by her response, we see that she did know God, and she knew that he was the one to turn to in a crisis. So let's read on from verse 9, a response to crisis. Once, when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly, and made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I'm a woman who's deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. So there we go. Despite her anguish, which is so evident in the text, we see Hannah's response to the crisis she was in. We see where she did and didn't turn. So we're going to start with what she didn't turn to. She didn't turn away from God. So often in a crisis, we turn to other things and other people, or even turn in on ourselves rather than turning to God, don't we? But here it's clear she didn't turn from God. For example, we see she went to the temple. We see that she didn't turn to drink. That's really clear, isn't it? But rather she says to Eli, I've not been drinking wine or beer. Nor, it says, did she turn to sin. She says, do not take your servant for a wicked woman. Now, there are all sorts of sins that we can turn to that are not part of God's law. It might have been prostitution back in that day. In our day, there can be other things that we can turn to that are against God's law. There are things that we can turn to instead of God, which, Hannah doesn't do. Neither did she just give up and wallow in self-pity. Because we can see all the way through the text, these action words. She purposefully stood up. She made a vow. She kept on praying to the Lord. She poured out her soul. Sometimes it's easy to give up when we're feeling up against it. It's also easy to turn away from God, blaming him for the situation that we're in. But all of these responses usually end up hurting us and making things worse. So, what did Hannah do? She turned to the Lord. She turned purposefully to the Lord. She left the celebrations and her family to go to the temple and pray. She not only poured out her heart to the Lord, telling him how she was feeling, which, can I say, God just loves for us to do that. We see that all the way through the Psalms. But there are two really remarkable things about her prayer that really stand out. Firstly, she prays, remember your servant. Now, on the surface of things, it seems like she's saying, God, you've forgotten me, but that's not actually what she's doing. Remember your servant is covenantal language for remember the promises that you have made as a faithful covenantal God. There's a verse in Deuteronomy 7 which says, and because you listen to these rules, God says, and keep them and do them, the Lord your God will keep you with the covenant and the steadfast love that he swore to your fathers. He will love you, bless you, and multiply you. He will also bless the fruit of your womb and the fruit of your ground and your new wine and oil, and increase your herds and the young of your flock and the land that he swore to your fathers to give you. You shall be blessed above all people. There shall not be a male or female barren among you or among your livestock. So this is a promise God has made to bless his people if they are faithful and obedient to him. Again, this is Old Testament covenant. Hannah's standing on this promise. She's saying, God, you're faithful, and you promised this. She's effectively praying, remember your promise to bless faithful people with children. You need to be true to your word, God, because that's who you are. So she's standing on God's character. That's the first thing. But the second thing that stands out in her prayer is that she makes this vow. She remarkably vows to give this child back to the Lord as what would have been a Nazirite in those times, someone set apart to work and serve God in the temple. That's a massive promise to make, to give your child over to the Lord like this. But I think it shows us that it's God's reputation that is the most important thing in Hannah's life. She wants a child so that he can serve God and be faithful to God and bear God's image in the world. She's not asking for a child to fulfill her own desires and make her happy. Even in this, she puts God first. And so Hannah's prayer tells us what our next principle is. And that is that we can turn to God in our times of crises. We can turn to God in our times of crises by pouring out our hearts and holding on to his promises and seeking his glory. Well, we're now at the culmination of the crisis. Once Hannah had prayed, we see a really different picture of her. Let's read the next section from verse 17. So Eli answered, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you've asked of him." She said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." Then she went away and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Early the next morning, they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, and Samuel means the Lord has heard, saying, because I asked the Lord for him. And so, having prayed, Hannah trusted God. And I love the beautiful two-way relationship here, because we see God giving Hannah assurance that he'd heard through Eli's words. And we see Hannah actively trusting God and getting on with life. She ate, she rejoined the family in worship. She made love to her husband, she got back on with life. And notice that her worship and her sense of peace and her countenance just being back to her normal self again, all happened before she knew what the result of the prayer would be, before the child was conceived and came along. Her countenance, her worship, was because she knew God had heard her and she trusted him. But in verse 19, we see that God remembered her. That's the same covenantal language. And she became pregnant. She names the baby Samuel because she asked the Lord for him, and because Samuel means God heard me. So, principle. Our last principle is that God sees, hears, and is faithful to fulfill his promises at the right time. God sees, hears, and is faithful to fulfill his promises at the right time. So we can trust him and praise him even if we don't understand what he's doing. Now, as I've studied the passage, the way that I've often summarized Hannah's little, response is in 3 words, 3-6. Turning to God, taking action, and worshipping. And turning to God, taking action, and worshipping. And these have really helped me in the last few weeks since I'd kind of been studying it, because there's been a few different situations that I'm like, and I go into panic mode, and I don't know what to do, and I'm like, hang on a minute, turn to God, pray about this. And it might not be eloquent prayers, it might just be like, prayers, but turning to God. And then taking action. Are the things that I can do that are just right and good things to do in this situation? One of the situations you can ask me about later, I'll not go into It was just a financial situation. I was like, okay, I'll phone person, I'll get some advice, and I'll make some. And then, having done all that, even though it hadn't changed the situation was still what the situation was, worship God for being the God who sees and cares and knows and is sovereign over it. And I've certainly felt a sense of peace and strength to keep going and to go on, even though I haven't necessarily seen an answer to those prayers just yet. So I wonder if those three little things might be helpful for us or for you in the different crises that you're going through. So, time to conclude. And I'm just going to give you the really briefest overview of what happens next. You can read it in the rest of the chapters. But the story goes on. Hannah keeps her vow and gives Samuel to the Lord, he grows up in the temple and becomes the last judge of Israel, a faithful judge who is instrumental in leading Israel to choose and appoint their first king. He's a key figure in the big story of God's chosen people as they bear witness to the world of a greater king to come. Then in chapter 2, Hannah prays another prayer of thanksgiving, which is like a prophetic prayer. It speaks of God's greatness and strength, the upside-down nature of God's plans and his world and his kingdom. And it foretells of another girl who can't have children because she's a virgin this time, having a miraculous conception and giving birth to a king, the Messiah. And it's amazing how this remarkable picture of God working out his big plan of salvation in the world is worked in with this personal story of this one seemingly insignificant lady that we read about in 1 Samuel. So, where do you turn when times are tough, when life is in crisis? And I want to encourage you that we can turn to God in times of crisis because he's sovereign, because he sees us and hears us, because he cares about us, and because we're part of a bigger redemption plan of what he's doing in the world.